Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Tim Gordon. Oregon is taking on the Trump administration right now on two fronts, elections and the economy. A multi-state lawsuit challenges a recent executive order tied to mail-in voting, while a separate legal fight targets tariffs the state says are driving up costs for businesses and consumers. We sat down with Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield to break down both battles and what they mean for Oregonians. And joining us today, Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield. Thanks so much for being here.
Absolutely. Always good to see you.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. We know you're a busy man, so we'll get right to the questions. You recently announced Oregon has joined yet another lawsuit against the Trump administration, along with more than 20 states and D.C., over a new executive order by the president that has to do with the federal government restricting mail-in voting and expanding federal control over elections. Go into more detail about that executive order and why Oregon wants to block it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. This is another example of the president stepping out of the lanes, the powers that Congress gave him. At no time did our framers of our Constitution want one of the most powerful people in our country to be able to regulate and control our elections. That's pretty darn obvious, and the Constitution explicitly says that. And that's effectively the crux of our lawsuit, to sit there and say, hey, Mr. President, you don't get those powers. For us as Oregonians, the things that really should strike us and cause us a tremendous amount of concern is we've been doing vote by mail for 30 years. We've done it successfully. We've done it accurately with Republicans as Secretary of State, with Democrats Secretary of State. Right now, the president is trying to weaponize our U.S. Postal Service, and where we as Oregonians used to see that, and frankly should still see that, as a conduit to exercise our right to vote, the president wants to make that a gatekeeping entity to exercise that right. It's a very interesting flip. Postal Service has no business in our elections other than making sure that we get our ballots delivered on time.
And this has to do with them wanting us to put out an eligible voters list. And how does the U.S. Postal Service come into play there?
Well, here's the thing. The Postal Service, because this is such a vague order, in theory, could deny certain ballots from being returned or being delivered. And that is, again, kind of what I'm talking about. They're being viewed as a gatekeeper now, where they're wanting to weaponize this Postal Service versus, hey, their job is to make sure that mail gets delivered, as opposed to gatekeeping which ballots get delivered.
So the president continues to make claims without evidence of mass voter fraud and blames a lot of it on mail-in voting. What's your response to that?
I always just go back to what we as Oregonians say, right? We know, I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, we want accurate and honest elections. We have real data. We've had Republican secretaries of state that have talked about the integrity of our elections. We have Democrats that talk about the integrity of our elections as done by vote by mail here in this state. So we live in a unique period in time where actual real data does not play as big of a role as it once did, right? And the rhetoric rises to the top. And so my hope here to Oregonians, for all of us, that we can stay grounded in real facts as opposed to the rhetoric that you can see on Twitter or whatever the current social media platform is.
And the fact is, Oregon's been a trailblazer, really pioneering mail-in voting over other states in the country. There are a few other lawsuits in this same arena against the Trump administration, including fighting a requirement to show proof of citizenship to vote and cross-checking state voter rolls against federal databases. Can you talk about those issues and where they stand now?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of executive orders where we filed a lawsuit and have already been successful. We've had a case where the federal government has sued us as a state to make sure that we're turning over data or wanting us to turn over data. For instance, our voter rolls. And right now you have a Trump administration that has already abused the use of private and confidential information in various other ways during the last year. We've offered the federal government, hey, you can have the publicly available information, such as addresses and names, that everyone else has access to. However, you don't get that private confidential information that, frankly, no law allows you to be entitled to. And that's some of the disputes that are going on. And again, in those cases, what we really try and do of objectively, take our cases into court. And because we've been doing that, and hopefully in what people perceive as a nonpartisan way, we've been very successful in the court so far.
Are they? How do they stand right now? Are there things out there that are getting anywhere close to resolution, or?
So in some of the cases, you're seeing the federal government actually withdraw from certain arguments. Other ones are continuing to trickle in. The lower courts have ruled with us when we are getting rulings on these cases.
All right. Well, a statement last week by a White House spokesperson said, quote, election integrity has always been a top priority for President Trump, and the American people sent him back to the White House because they overwhelmingly supported his common sense election integrity agenda. And the president will do everything in his power to defend the safety and security of American elections and to ensure that only American citizens are voting in them. Again, a chance to respond for you.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. I think, my dad's a Republican. My mother's a Green Party member. When you look at both of them, they both want accurate and honest elections, and so do I. And so I appreciate what the president is saying, that he wants accurate and honest elections, but the fact remains that he continues to look back to 2020 and saying that that election was stolen. I think we as Americans have to look forward and focus on the values of what does it really mean to have an accessible system where we as citizens can exercise our right to vote. And I think we've got that here in Oregon resoundingly. And frankly, I think we should be looking at Oregon as a model for the country in terms of accessibility and ease of voting, and most importantly, the integrity of our system. And so I think that's what we need to focus aspirationally forward, not do what the president does and go back and say, hey, I didn't like how 2020 went. I think it was stolen from me. Now I want to manipulate the process going forward. And you got to remember what he's doing right now, because this is what politicians who are historically unpopular do. They try and start messing with our elections. They like to rig our elections. That's what they started doing with redistricting across this country, right? So again, looking at what that story is, what's really going on here, historically unpopular president, historically unpopular actions, now wants to start messing with our elections. I think we should focus on the values and look forward.
And as you step back from all of that, the fact is that voting is really handled by states. It's in their purview, right? Can you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is what is in the Constitution, right? And I think it was the beautiful part about the way our Constitution was drafted. Again, we didn't want the most powerful person in the country to be able to control and regulate our elections. That's a bad idea. The framers of our Constitution knew it, and they put it in writing. And the idea is that if Congress is silent on time, place, and manner of elections, that power goes to the states, right? And we use objective data. And part of the reason you want that, right, is whenever you have federal lists or federal information, we all know there's a separation between the federal government and individuals. The states, generally speaking, when you look historically, always have more accurate and up-to-date information, which is incredibly important when we're trying to focus on the integrity and the accuracy of our elections. And that's why this has been left to the states, Republican and Democrat, across the country.
All right, Attorney General, final question on voting now. Are there any changes that could be made to our voting system here in Oregon to strengthen it?
Right. I am always looking at important ways, and this is a question that frankly really should involve the Secretary of State, the Oregon legislature, and the public. The first thing that I look to is, how do you continue to remove barriers for people to be able to access their ability to vote, right? And in a modernizing world, I think we should all be looking at how are we continuing to modernize our electoral systems to make sure that we're meeting people where they are, making sure that voters the information they need to cast an informed decision. I think we're in an increasingly strained world where we're just trying to find out what we're going to put on the dinner table at the end of the evening, and we get time to vote. And when we have that time, we want to have as much information in front of us as possible. So I think that's incredibly important. How do we modernize getting new information? And then at the same time, I think there's a broader conversation about accessibility. And then the third thing I would say is, I think what we really need to do is start getting back to real facts and bringing back the actual real facts about the integrity of our systems here in the United States, and educating voters about those systems and how difficult it is if someone even wanted to engage in fraud, talking about what's really going on in these clerks' offices across our state.
All right, switching gears now, you're really a frequent flyer these days. In fact, you'll soon be in New York again to take on the president over his international tariffs. Now, you led the effort and beat him on this in round one. Now it's round two. Describe the history here first, and then what do you hope to accomplish and why this time?
Yeah, so for folks just to kind of get caught up or remember where we've been, more than a year ago, we filed our first lawsuit against President Trump's unconstitutional tariffs. And the reason we did that is he was abusing an emergency power. All three levels of courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, agreed with us. Right after we won in the Supreme Court, in the same breath, after attacking the United States Supreme Court justices, the president decided to use another law that had never been used for these types of tariffs again. And here's the thing. If the president wants to do tariffs and use the appropriate statutes, he can do so. Congress has given him some powers. However, when you're going to twist statutes, lawyerly ways, we're going to hold you accountable in court. And that's what he's done. And so that's why you have the second lawsuit. And the reason these things are so darn important, right? If you go talk to small businesses in Oregon, if you go talk to individuals, if you look at the costs of these cases, we are feeling that across the state. We're feeling it as an economy in our state. And so this lawsuit is incredibly important. We have that case filed. We're in court Friday morning in New York, arguing that in the Court of International Trade, which is the court of original jurisdiction in cases like these.
All right, maybe you can get more specific about the damages. Can you quantify the damage these tariffs have done or are doing to Oregonians? What's the evidence that you have for that?
Yeah, this is the thing that I think is really important for folks to realize, because it feels very speculative. What's the impact of the tariffs? You don't always see that when you go to the store. So what I like to do is use the president's lawyers and the president's own words when we're thinking about this. In front of the United States Supreme Court justices, they talked about, and if I remember correctly, it was anywhere up to 70 to 80% of these tariffs were being paid by Americans. There was a recent study put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that showed that it was about 90% of these tariffs are being paid by Americans, right? So we use institutional figures. You shouldn't take my word for it. You should look at what we call trusted third-party validators. Say, hey, what's that real impact? What's the economic impact? Then, more importantly, talk to all of your friends that are small businesses. Talk to restaurant owners. Talk to people in your community, and they will tell you story after story, because we've heard them, about the impacts of how these costs have increased, which then means the cost for you and I, when we go to the restaurant, when we go to the store, those costs are increased for us as well.
Yeah, and we profiled many of those small businesses here on KGW. So what's the status of the tariff refund program that was put in place after that first Supreme Court decision in February? Is that money going out yet? And do you have any advice for business owners affected here in Oregon?
Absolutely. This is one of the most bizarre things that happened. Right after we get this win in the Supreme Court, that Trump says, well, hey, I'm not paying that money back. The irony of him saying that is his lawyers had been in the lower court saying we are going to pay the money back. And they were telling courts we're going to pay the money back. So don't actually pause these tariffs while this case is pending. Shortly thereafter, I think kind of they got their dots connected in the federal government, and they said, have made assertions in the Court of International Trade. We are going to find ways to make sure that every business that has paid money gets repaid. And so that's a process that is in development in Congress right now. I think there are some members of Congress looking to find quicker and more efficient ways to deliver that money to consumers and to businesses that have paid. And so I expect that process to roll out over the upcoming months. But here's the thing. When you unconstitutionally take money out of the pockets of businesses here in the United States, you got to put that money back in their pocket, right? So it's pretty simple, and that's what they're trying to do.
Yep, and I think it's big money, too. I think I heard the figure of more than $160 billion in that refund issue. Well,
yeah.
Whether you are for or against President Trump and his policies, most everyone can agree there's a lot going on. Every day it seems like there's something new. So what's your standard as Attorney General strategy for what Oregon chooses to fight with these legal challenges?
Well, first and foremost, this is only one of many responsibilities we have at the Oregon Department of Justice, and we kind of classify this as how do we uphold the values of Oregonians. And so through that lens, we look at this stuff very objectively. A, when an action is taken by the president, we have to ask the question, are Oregonians being harmed? If the answer is yes, then you go to the second part of the analysis, which is, has a law or the Constitution been broken? If the answer to that is yes, then we say, does Oregon have standing, which is the legal standard to be in court to represent Oregonians? And if the answers to all of those are yes, then we file a lawsuit and we move forward. Because I think we've had this pretty, what I would say, very high standard for how we do this, we've been incredibly successful in a lot of the lawsuits that we've been bringing.
Well, you are Oregon Attorney General at a very interesting time in our history. Dan Rayfield, thanks again for joining us today.
Absolutely. Always. Thanks for having me, Tim.